A year that changed the face of the world. After 1945, nothing will ever be the same. The last year of World War II is one of gruesome battles.
It's chaotic, it's out of control.
January sees raging combat in the Ardennes forest.
This surprise attack did take the Americans totally by surprise.
In April, street battles erupt in Berlin.
Block by block, self-propelled artillery pieces, tanks.
Adolf Hitler decides to fight to the death.
He had no doubt about his own death, but he felt that the German people should share his death.
In the Pacific, the end of the nightmare is taking just as long.
The Japanese strategy is still the same. Inflict as many casualties on the Allies as possible.
On August 6th, the Americans dropped the first atomic bomb in history.
Everything changed. Human beings could create weapons so terrible that they could basically eliminate their own existence.
The violence in 1945 is beyond belief, as demonstrated in Auschwitz and other Nazi concentration camps.
The horror was almost beyond human imagination.
Genocide, historical trials, and the creation of the United Nations. Will the world ever recover? Signs of the Cold War are already looming.
All of Central and Eastern Europe were under the diplomatic and military domination of the Red Army.
Thanks to exceptional archive footage, you're about to discover the decisive moments of our history. Month by month, you'll be able to grasp the major stakes of this extraordinary year.
It lays the foundation for what is our world today. 1945 was enormously consequential.
At the beginning of 1945, Europe continues to be ablaze. Nazi Germany is caught in a vice, yet it keeps on fighting. In the east, the Red Army has gained ground. In the west, the Allies have freed practically the entire French territory. They've settled in Belgium and forayed into Holland in often extreme conditions.
The winter of 1944 to 1945 was a particularly harsh winter. It was also very dispiriting, as you might imagine, for all of the soldiers living in these muddy trenches or whatever, often in floodplains.
The biggest problem on the American side is the lack of proper foot gear. In other words, like your feet are immersed in icy water, slush, snow for far too long, and they're not insulated well enough. And of course, you're not taking your boots off in this kind of environment. And eventually, your feet just start to die. If we're looking really at the daily soldier's plight, there is a sense, when is this going to be over? When will this nightmare ever end?
As the month of January begins, the troops are engaged in one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war in Europe. 2 weeks earlier, the Germans launched a violent counterattack in the heart of the Ardennes. Hitler's goal is to turn the tables by taking the Allies by surprise.
Chose the Ardennes because, as the name would indicate, there's a lot of forested areas, a lot of pine trees, fir trees, a lot of little bottleneck towns and gorges and valleys and little rivers, all this. It's not really good country for mechanized warfare.
The Nazi strategy was one basically of holding the Western, the Anglo-Saxon armies on the line of the River Rhine. But Hitler had this idea that he wanted to surprise and astonish the world with a huge counterattack in the Ardennes. The idea being basically he felt, and this was sheer fantasy, that if he managed to charge across the River Meuse and then swing north all the way to Anvers and capture that port, this would actually knock the British out of the war.
Antwerp was a very important target for both sides. It would give the Allies the port they desperately needed, while the Germans wanted to prevent the landing of additional weapons in Europe.
The leaders of the German army have lost faith in Hitler's plans, but the Fuhrer is determined to see things through.
In fact, his generals had all been against the whole plan. They knew it was never going to work. But Hitler was obsessive. We know by this stage how much he was taking in the way of drugs. He was also suffering from certain withdrawal symptoms as well. His judgment had completely disappeared. And it's quite interesting that the British had cancelled Operation Foxley, which was their plan to assassinate Hitler, because they knew now that they would win the war more rapidly with Hitler still in command of strategy.
A mere few hours into the new year, the German Air Force launches an offensive. The Luftwaffe attacks Allied bases in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France.
The British suffered the most, mainly because they targeted more British airfields than the others. But in fact, actually, it was a disaster for the Luftwaffe. Apart from anything else, because they kept the operation so secret, it was German anti-aircraft defenses, DCR, who were shooting down many of the planes. But now altogether, some 271 planes were shot down and 230 pilots, which the German Luftwaffe simply could not afford to lose, were killed or captured during the course of this operation.
Defeated in the air, the Germans are once again on the defensive.
The Germans were hopelessly inferior. We estimate that in 1945, the superiority of the Allies over the German Luftwaffe was 14-fold. Therefore, the Germans were basically no longer able to withstand the superiority of the Allies in the sky.
Despite the exhaustion of their troops, the Allies regained the upper hand. Running short on fuel, the German army is forced to retreat.
This surprise attack did take the Americans totally by surprise. But they did react with astonishing speed, and only the Americans had, again, the resources with troops. They were bringing in up to 45,000 men a day in reinforcements.
On January 16th, Adolf Hitler leaves his East Prussia headquarters and returns to Berlin. Upon arrival, he'll order the next operations from his bunker. The future of the Reich is at stake, since the situation is also deteriorating on the Eastern Front. 4 days earlier, the Red Army has launched a major offensive.
You have armies attacking across the Vistula, north into East Prussia, and all the way across towards the River Oder. The Red Army had 6.7 million troops between the Baltic and the Adriatic. So from this point of view, they had more than double the German armies present on that front.
The best of the German forces sent in the Ardennes are sorely missed to fend off Stalin's troops. The Soviets gained ground in East Prussia as well as in Polish territory.
They took basically no precautions. They didn't bother to wait for the bridges to arrive. They would literally take their tanks through the river. It was extremely effective because by the time Hitler sent his orders forward to the commanders at the front, they were at least 24 hours out of date. And by then, the Soviet forces had gone far beyond the particular front that they imagined still existed.
Germany must draw on its last strengths. The regime is forced to rely on its popular militias. At the end of 1944, the Nazis had implemented mass mobilization of all able men between 16 and 60 years of age. Mere delusion in the face of the Soviet steamroller.
The idea of defending the territory by Volkssturm units, which were made up of simple civilians who were supposed to know how to fight, proved to be a catastrophic strategy. The situation was utterly absurd.
Eine völlig absurde Situation. Natürlich waren sie überhaupt nicht in der Lage, den Russen.
They were obviously in no position to oppose the Russians. With only handguns and bazookas at their disposal, they were hopelessly inferior to the Russian tanks.
Panzern unterlegen.
The Red Army continues to advance with unprecedented violence.
When Stalin heard about the way the Soviet troops were behaving towards the Germans and their civilians, he said their actions were understandable given what they had gone through. After all, they had witnessed the destruction of their country and the loss of their friends and relatives. Who cared if some of them messed around with a few German women? To this day, it's still used as an explanation, even an excuse, for the crimes they committed. Did they take pity on us? No. Then we will do the same.
The previous massacres perpetrated by the German troops are fueling the Soviets' thirst for vengeance, but the law of retaliation doesn't explain everything.
Under Soviet society, any form of sexuality had been completely repressed, and many of these soldiers were totally ignorant. And quite often they needed alcohol to give them the courage. Then they went out in hunting parties at night. And many of the women either sometimes, well, as we know from Soviet reports, killed their children and tried to kill themselves. It was appalling.
The Soviets spread terror among the civilian population. The Germans living in the east are forced to flee. This leads to a mass exodus.
The brutality imputed to the Russians was part of Goebbels' propaganda, but it was also fueled by the soldiers' experience. The arrival of the Russian troops on German soil caused widespread panic, which obviously urged people to flee East Prussia.
That isn't the extent of the horrors of World War II. What the world is about to uncover is beyond words. Ten days after setting foot in the ruins of Warsaw, the Red Army enters the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. On January 27, 1945, while progressing in Polish territory, Soviet soldiers stumbled upon the survivors of the horrors inflicted by the Nazis.
The troops had to improvise on the spot in terms of what to do with the few survivors. Let's not forget that the concentration camps had been emptied of their prisoners by the SS, or that they had at least taken those who were still able to stand and walk. They were thrown out on the road and sent to West German and Austrian camps on what was later called the Death Marches. When the Red Army got to Auschwitz, there were only 7,000 prisoners left on site, and most of them were dying.
Over 1 million men, women, and children had been killed here. The vast majority being Jews, exterminated in gas chambers. Soviet cameras record what is left of them. The Nazis had recovered everything they could through a morbid recycling process. In order to get rid of the bodies, the executioners had used these crematory ovens. The Nazis saw it as an efficient and discreet tool. Polish citizens, gypsies, and political prisoners had also been executed in Auschwitz.
People had known about concentration camps, of course, already before the end of the war. If you look at Anne Frank's diary, and who was Anne Frank? She was a little girl in an attic. But she heard it on the BBC radio, and she even heard about the gas chambers, so none of this was new. But knowing about things is never quite the same thing as actually seeing them. The horror was almost beyond human imagination.
However, what the Soviet soldiers discover is merely the tip of the Nazi crimes. Hitler's men had gone to great lengths to erase any evidence of their savagery.
Near the end of the war, the SS started dismantling some of their mass extermination sites. This was the case for the Sobibor and Treblinka camps, for instance. They also blasted the gas chamber at Birkenau. The reason for this was that the genocide of the European Jews had always been kept secret. It was never assumed publicly by the Nazi regime.
Auschwitz will go down in history as one of the worst crimes ever committed by mankind. But right now, the war rages on, and diplomatic affairs are underway. February begins with a summit conference held in an old Tsar palace on the shores of the Black Sea. Here, near Yalta, a small resort city in Crimea, the Allied leaders decide to meet. British Prime Minister Churchill, American President Roosevelt, and Soviet Premier Stalin wish to hasten victory and prepare for the post-war period.
This summit established the great alliance between the Anglo-Saxons and the Soviets. Later on, it became common belief that the Yalta Conference was aimed at splitting the world between the participants. But in fact, it was quite the opposite. The Allies voted a final declaration saying that, once freed, Europe would organize free elections under the supervision of the three superpowers.
Despite a friendly atmosphere between the Allies, each leader has his own agenda.
Stalin had his main priority, which was to assure Soviet control over Central Europe, and above all, Poland. Because as far as Stalin was concerned, that was where he had been surprised in June 1941, and never again was he going to allow the Soviet Union to be taken by surprise. Roosevelt had a very different priority. He had this idealistic view of preventing war in the future by the creation of the United Nations, and this was going to be his legacy. He was prepared to make concessions to Stalin so as to get Stalin into the war against Japan, but above all to agree to the United Nations.
On the British side, Her Majesty's Prime Minister is quite wary of the Soviet monster.
Churchill was horrified because he knew that basically what Stalin was doing now with his control over Poland and of Central Europe, that this actually was going to lead to tension in the future.
Stalin obtained a lot in Yalta. Since the conference was held in Crimea, the delegations had to be brought there by trains that went through places that had been devastated by the war. Moreover, the trains were ordered to considerably reduce their speed in areas where the damages were more serious. So, by the time the delegations reached Yalta, Stalin was able to get an agreement in principle, stating that the USSR would get half of Germany's war reparations.
The Allies agree to divide Germany in occupied territories once victory is secured. But the war against the Third Reich is far from over. Despite the inevitable defeat, the Germans are still resisting. In order to bring Hitler to his knees, the British and American forces unleash a hail of fire. Just 200 kilometers away from Berlin, the Allies strike the city of Dresden with incendiary bombs.
The city was smashed by the bombing, the tram lines were ripped up and all the rest of it. But above all, it was the people who were there.
The toll is horrifying. In Dresden, between 25 and 35,000 civilians die under the bombs. Simultaneously, the Allied armies keep attacking on the ground. The march towards Berlin is a major logistical challenge.
You've got serious manpower problems for the British and the Canadians. The French manpower is rising, though. Of course, as the Allied armies have liberated France, more and more young men have rallied to the cause of the new French army that's fighting there alongside the old resistance fighters, colonial troops who have fought their way from North Africa now into France. But really, the bulk of the Western Allied armies are now American. And this has really become very much an American show.
Despite the freezing winter and a violent enemy resistance, the First French Army, with the support of the Americans, finally liberates the Colmar pocket on February 9th. But a natural border still stands in the way of the Allies.
Hitler's mindset at this point is to fight to the end. So he hopes that the Rhine will be an impenetrable barrier in the West to the Western Allies, and thus he can then hold on to the heart of Germany that way.
In order to block the Allies' progression, the Germans destroy the bridges over the Rhine. At the very last moment, the Americans managed to take over the Remagen Bridge, the only one still standing. The Germans try to destroy it, but only a section is damaged. On March 7th, the Allies cross the river and establish a bridgehead on the right bank. The heart of the Reich is now in the crosshairs of the U.S. Army. This news urges Stalin to pick up the pace.
Now, the Soviet general, who is with Eilersenhower's headquarters, as soon as he hears this, he relays this to Stalin. Now he knew that actually the Americans might get to Berlin before him, and that was why he immediately summoned back Marshal Zhukov to Moscow and Marshal Konev, basically to plan the Berlin operation as soon as possible.
The inevitable defeat of the Reich stirs up the rivalry between the Allied powers. General staff are agitated by the symbol of victory at stake. Which army will get to Berlin first? Which flag will fly over the Reich's capital? At the other end of the world, the Allies are fighting the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. Over 3 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Americans are prevailing. In early March of 1945, the battle is raging on the island of Iwo Jima. Located some 1,000 kilometers from Tokyo, it would offer a valuable base to the Allied Air Force. But on this island riddled with underground defense, the boys are facing a bloody guerrilla war.
The Japanese have developed this extraordinary martial culture in which the soldiers had been completely brainwashed, they were beaten by their NCOs, and they were determined to fight to the end. I mean, it was quite astonishing. No soldier was allowed to surrender. The humiliation at home would be intense.
Retreated in trenches, caves, and bunkers, the Japanese soldiers can emerge at any time. The Americans try to force them out with grenades and flamethrowers. Confronted with this ruthless and unpredictable enemy, the troops are overcome by paranoia.
The important thing was never to allow them to surrender. In fact, they were wounded was to kill them quickly, just in case they had a grenade hidden, because many of them did. It got to such a stage that there were even cases of, say, Marines and others who would just literally cut the head off Japanese corpses and then boil the head so as to send the skull home as a souvenir. There was a dehumanization in that particular war on both sides, which was pretty shocking.
In order to ensure victory, the Allies go beyond close combat. They decide to destroy enemy cities with bombs. From the night of March 9th to the 10th, Tokyo is their intended target. The U.S. Air Force sends bombers to strike the Japanese capital. The pilot's orders are ruthless.
Low-level nighttime incendiary bombing, just basically to burn out Japan's cities. There's a lot of cottage industries that are melded in with the residential areas, and in many of those areas, of course, the buildings are built of wood and paper and whatnot that are quite vulnerable. In many cases, the American B-29 crewmen will open up their bomb bay doors, and immediately they're hit with the stench of burning flesh, burning detritus, burning hair.
The empire of the Rising Sun's capital is burned to the ground, resulting in 100,000 victims. It's the deadliest bombing of the entire war.
How do you basically attack islands which are strongly defended, like the Japanese archipelago, without bombing first? It was the way that Allied commanders had to reduce their own casualties because of pressure from Parliament and the press at home that forced them into using so much in the way of bombing, which killed enemy civilians.
Back in Europe, the Americans reach the heart of Germany. In the beginning of April, they also discover the horrors of Nazi camps. In Ohrdruf, one of the annexed camps of Buchenwald, General Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces on the continent, witnesses the emaciated victims with his own eyes.
The knowledge of the death camps had emerged and was confirmed by December 1942, but to actually see the reality, to smell the reality of these camps, of these corpses rotting away, not being removed or buried, everybody was too weak. So from that point of view, the vision was so appalling.
It was such a shock that General Eisenhower decided this had to be publicized very widely in news broadcasts, in cinemas and radio and so on, so that people would finally understand what the war was fought for. He himself was horrified.
The U.S. military government decided to bring the German people and confront the civilians with what had gone on just a few kilometers from their home.
The Allies must now take charge of the victims. But the survivors of Nazi brutality are so weak that many perish soon after.
The trouble was that on the Western Front, when American and British soldiers found these starving skeletons, basically, in the camps, they immediately tried to give them food, which was the worst thing they could do because they would just wolf down the food and most of them died almost immediately afterwards.
What will they do with these men and women who managed to survive? The question raised in the spring of 1945 will become one of the major challenges of the post-war period. The deported people are now refugees.
Many of the Jews who came from places like Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, and so on, couldn't really go back home because there was nobody left. They'd lost all their family, their friends. These were often places that were still hostile to Jews, and so they had nowhere to go. And so the old concentration camps then became so-called displaced persons camps, where some people, desperate to go somewhere, Palestine, the United States, anywhere, were cooped up, and sometimes for years.
The Allies are getting ever closer to Berlin. The Americans are now less than 100 kilometers away from the Reich's capital. However, General Eisenhower makes a decision that will raise controversy among his own faction.
Eisenhower makes what he terms a military decision, but it's also a political decision in the sense of saying, you know what, we're not going to go with our armies to Berlin. We're not going to be part of that meat grinder fight there. Already had the Yalta meeting on the part of the Allied leaders in which they had agreed to joint occupation zones in Berlin. So Eisenhower was not willing to lose the lives of British, Canadian, American soldiers for terrain you were going to maybe give up to the Soviets.
The Americans let the Red Army pay the blood money. Eisenhower, however, will have to shoulder the political cost of his decision.
Churchill was furious because Churchill wanted to push as far east as possible because he felt that the way that Stalin was behaving over Poland, with the suppression of all of those who'd fought the Germans in the Warsaw Uprising, in the way that Polish politicians were being arrested and murdered, and he hoped that if the Allies continued their advance as far as possible to the east, then they would be in a stronger negotiating position with Stalin.
The Red Army has free rein. Stalin's troops are ready to use their firepower against the Reich's capital.
In 1945, the strength of the Soviet army relied on one simple fact: their numeric superiority in terms of manpower and equipment. Their aircrafts and tanks outnumbered the enemy's. From that standpoint, it was a war of number, not skill.
One of the great ironies is that actually, if the Americans had not given 500,000 military vehicles to the Soviet Union, the Americans would have got to Berlin long before the Red Army.
On the German side, Hitler is still hiding away in his bunker with a last line of defense of a few loyalists.
He had another option, a fortress in the Alps, which had been extended. Some of his men begged him to continue the battle from there, but Hitler wanted to stay in Berlin.
The Fuhrer refuses to accept defeat. He locks himself into a suicidal way of thinking.
Hitler had these fantasies of different armies suddenly counterattacking or capturing or surrounding the Russians, which bore no relation to reality at all. He was still obsessed with his ideas of wonder weapons, the Wunderwaffen, which didn't exist.
The Soviet divisions are about to launch an attack on Berlin. 2.5 million men are preparing to swarm into the German capital. On April 16th, at dawn, the final offensive begins.
Over 2 million shells were fired on that very first day. The artillery was literally sort of parked wheel to wheel in such a concentration.
Joseph Stalin still saw Berlin as the ultimate objective in Europe, as the ultimate symbol of who really won the war against Nazism. And of course, there's already major tension between East and West in the Allied coalition. Stalin initially could not even believe that the Western Allies were not going to push for Berlin at all. And he thought they were trying to trick him by saying they weren't.
The whole idea was to surround Berlin to prevent the Americans getting through. And the reason for this was because of all the nuclear research being carried out in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in southwest Berlin, and Stalin was obsessed about preventing the Americans getting there because he knew from his spies that the Americans were developing the atomic bomb. And therefore, he did not want them to get to Berlin and get, first of all, the uranium, which the Germans had there, or to capture the German scientists.
Already devastated by the bombing, the German capital sinks into desolation. For Hitler, the clock is ticking.
He knew by then he was going to die, usually by suicide, because Hitler had this terrible fear of being taken back to Moscow in an iron cage and being humiliated. So he had no doubt about his own death, but he felt that the German people should share his death.
Der Führer empfängt in seinem Hauptquartier den Reichsjugendführer Axmann mit einer
In utter disarray, on his 56th birthday, the Führer decides to make a public appearance.
And here you actually see the last film of Hitler as he goes along the line of young heroes from the Hitler Youth, who've been used, in fact, basically as suicide squads. He was in such an advanced stage of decay and disability.
The next day, on April 21st, 1945, the Soviets enter the city. The Battle of Berlin is exceptionally violent.
Block by block, combined arms warfare, self-propelled artillery pieces, tanks, infantry soldiers cleaning out sewers and building blocks and all that. And of course, everybody on the German side, just a weapon thrown at them and told to fight.
The Soviet troops were determined not to allow any attacks from behind, because as they advanced, they would find that there were all the civilians in the cellars. And sometimes, just in case there were soldiers hidden amongst them, they would just throw grenades into the cellars where the civilians were.
The Red Army aims to crush the last remaining Nazi soldiers.
When they attacked Berlin, the Soviet strategy was mainly to establish a numerical superiority in all sectors of the front. They wanted to strengthen their firepower by placing numerous artillery pieces in every direction, and finally, to march forward no matter the human toll.
The military strategy carried out by the Soviets is devastating.
They made many mistakes. They would send in their tanks into the streets, and this is where the Hitler Youth or the Volkssturm were able to ambush them out of cellar windows or from windows of houses using these Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. And the Soviets lost many casualties.
While Berlin sinks into chaos, the Allies join forces further south. On April 25th, the American troops and the Red Army meet on the banks of the Elbe.
There were obviously Red Army commissars coming who were frightened about the whole business of associating with capitalists, Westerners, and so forth, trying to control the troops. The American troops were fascinated and in some ways also slightly appalled when they saw and met their Red Army counterparts. Their uniforms, which were falling to pieces, their weapons, which were rusty and in a pretty bad way. But anyway, the lack of comprehension, this clash of cultures, was so enormous. Neither spoke the other's language, so, you know, they would share toasts to victory or whatever it might be. But I think the real idea going through American minds was, thank God the war is over, we can leave the old world, corrupt Europe, to get on with its own lives, and we'll go back home, we've done our job.
While waiting to return home, the men stand in front of the photographers. A symbolic picture immortalizes the event. On the left stands American Sub-Lieutenant William Robertson. Next to him is Soviet Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko. This emblematic picture will spread around the world. Far from these images of joyous celebrations, Hitler's Italian allies are punished by the victors. On April 28th, Benito Mussolini is executed by resistance fighters. The next day, in Milan, the fascist leader and his mistress are hung upside down. Their bodies are shouted down by a raging crowd. The news of this humiliating death reaches Germany.
Hitler had seen it. He was again afraid of his corpse being displayed in public. Hitler's determination was that his body should be burned.
Cornered, Adolf Hitler commits suicide. According to the latest studies, he took cyanide before shooting himself in the head. Germany collapses. The world envisioned by the Nazis is swept away. In Berlin and several other cities around the country, political leaders, military officers, and civilians commit suicide.
There was a huge number of suicides, especially after the news of Hitler's death. Obviously, they did not say on the radio he had committed suicide. They said he died leading his troops. It was a cover-up. But to many Germans, it was clear that Hitler's suicide was the only honorable solution. It is interesting to see how many Germans, including officials of the regime, believe they should kill themselves along with their families. Recent studies have looked into this and shown that this apocalyptic climate had been systematically implanted by Hitler. He had imagined the downfall of Germany being similar to a Wagnerian opera.
On the day of Hitler's death, bloody combats take place in the Reichstag, the historical parliament of the German Empire.
In Berlin, the troops followed battle tactics, ensuring the occupation of the city by taking one quarter after the next. In the end, even though some parts of the city were not yet secured, the main troops headed towards the empire's symbol, the Reichstag, in order to raise the red flag. Around the same time, Hitler had just committed suicide in his bunker, or maybe he was still alive.
History is written by the victors, and those need symbols.
We all remember the picture of the flag planted on the roof of the Reichstag. But in reality, the Reichstag had no political power during the Third Reich.
The picture taken by a Soviet photographer captures the event for posterity.
The whole story of the capture of the Reichstag rather depends on whether it's a question of the propaganda version or the real version. The propaganda version tries to claim that actually the red flag had been raised during that night so that it was there ready for the morning of the 1st of May. That actually is not true. This was actually a reconstruction. Even then, they had to retouch the photographs because the soldiers, as they held up the banner, their arms were covered in all the watches that they'd been looting.
After all these years of fierce combat and incalculable deaths, the war in Europe is finally over. But once again, in May 1945, the symbols alter the course of history. As 6 years of war come to an end, the continent is about to be subject to several unforeseen diplomatic developments. In Reims, the Germans arrive at Eisenhower's headquarters.
The Germans, of course, indicate their willingness to surrender unconditionally in the early morning hours of May 7, 1945. And they consummate a surrender, have a surrender ceremony in Reims, France, at Eisenhower's headquarters. And, of course, all the Western Allies are represented, and the Soviets, too.
But these images are not to the liking of the Kremlin's head. Stalin demands another ceremony.
He wanted it to be in Berlin, that the Soviets had taken, in the heart of their area. And so there's going to be another ceremony the next day, May 8, 1945. So if you ask an American, what's VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, they would say, well, it's May 7th. You ask a Russian, they'd say it's May 8th. And the Soviet general who participated in the surrender ceremony at Reims did not have a good future ahead of him.
Meanwhile, these geopolitical subtleties are of no consequence to the European people. After years of hardship, tears, and fears, it's time to celebrate.
In many countries, of course, the liberating armies were greeted like rock stars, really, because not only were they liberators, but they were also richer than the local population. They had chocolate to dispense, Hershey bars, silk stockings, chewing gum, and so on. And they brought jazz music with them.
They dance, they laugh, and fraternize.
One reason that 1945 was called the Summer of Love is that not only was there a lot of partying going on with the Allied troops, but an awful lot of children were born more or less 9 months after that event too. And it was just another sign of a world that was trying to sort of start from scratch and remake itself after all the death and the mayhem.
The rapes committed by certain GIs since the Normandy landings tarnished the image of the American liberators. Still, the cameramen capture the elation of the freedom-loving crowd. The excitement contrasts with the continuing bloodshed in the Pacific, thousands of kilometers from there.
The Battle of Okinawa is raging when VE Day happens. And the soldiers and Marines who are fighting on Okinawa hear, of course, all about it. And the correspondents are excited. They're eager to share this great news of the end of the war in Europe. And of course, everybody's happy to hear this, but the general attitude is, so what? How does that affect me?
After the seizing of Iwo Jima, the Americans are deep into the merciless battle to conquer the island of Okinawa. Around 500 kilometers from the main Japanese islands, Okinawa is a strategic goal.
There are now the preparations, in fact, for basically Operation Downfall, which is going to be the invasion of the home islands of Japan, which actually terrifies the Allied planners, the British and the Americans, because they are estimating that they are going to suffer 500,000 casualties.
During this relentless war, the Allied ships must face an airborne danger. Overwhelmed, the Japanese Air Force resort to a quasi-infallible weapon: the kamikazes.
They found at this particular point that their most effective way was simply to pack the aircraft full of explosives. And then they would use recruit pilots, new pilots who'd only just finished their pilot training, to fly these aircraft straight into American warships. They would always be accompanied by a veteran pilot in another aircraft ready to shoot them down if they wanted to change their mind at the last time and avoid crashing themselves.
The Japanese strategy is still the same. Inflict as many casualties on the Allies as possible, hang on as long as you can, and force some sort of negotiated solution or outcome to this war.
In Europe, the end of the war doesn't mean a return to happy days. For more than a year, the liberation has been striking the hour of vengeance, with its share of violence, humiliation, and injustice.
In France, women had their heads shaved, or people were chased in the streets because they had actually or supposedly collaborated with the Germans.
During the Nazi occupation, women had German boyfriends in the German army, had various liaisons with Germans, sometimes because it was the only way to eat, sometimes because it was an adventure, sometimes to be free of an oppressive family. There were all kinds of reasons. But it added to the sense of humiliation that people felt about being occupied by the enemy.
During the summer of 1945, accounts are settled through the justice system, too. In Paris, the trial of Philippe Pétain is brought before the High Court of Justice. Now 89 years old, the former head of the Vichy regime stands accused of treason and collusion with the enemy.
For de Gaulle, and above all for the Gaullists, the one person who needed to be tried, almost to prove the illegality of the Vichy regime, was of course Marshal Pétain himself. This was a dubious form of justice. It was a question of creating sometimes laws which had not really existed before. It was a pretense that the État français had never existed legally in any form. There was a need, if you like, to prevent justice being done in the épuration sauvage, but there was also a question of an unease that it was not really going to be very convincing in legal terms.
Marshal Pétain is sentenced to death, but his sentence is commuted to life in prison. The former head of the Vichy regime is also subject to national indignation. The joy brought by the liberation quickly fades away. Returning deportees, political conflicts, rationing, Europe faces a vertiginous question: how does one rebuild a devastated continent?
The struggle is just beginning. Who's going to pay for that, and what does it cost? Imagine if your house had been destroyed in combat. Can you still live there or not? What is your life going to be? Have you lost people to the war from your family, and how is that going to affect you?
the areas which have been fought through. Normandy in France, the destruction there has been appalling. Whether one looks at the Netherlands, the starvation of the Hunger Winter. In Italy, the starvation there, Yugoslavia, almost all of Europe had suffered appallingly in that particular way.
Many people wondered whether Europe or their town, whatever it happened to be, could ever come back and could ever be the same again.
The defeated are confronted with unprecedented devastation. The Reich has been annihilated. German society is crushed.
Der öffentliche Verkehr existiert nicht mehr.
Public transportation no longer existed, or hardly at all. Most of the houses had been destroyed. The situation was catastrophic. It was estimated that 38 million houses in Germany were damaged or destroyed during the war.
The victors are determined to profit from the destruction of the Reich. The Allies notably want to get their hands on the technologies created by Hitler's engineers. As early as May, German scientists surrendered to the Americans. Among them is Werner von Braun, the creator of Nazi rockets. These high-level scientists decide to change sides and work for the benefit of Uncle Sam. The U.S. Army doesn't only recover brain power. V-2 rockets, fighter jets. A lot of German equipment is transferred over to the United States. The Americans proudly display their loot. But beyond the flaunting, the transfer of technology holds a strategic importance. During the Cold War, the knowledge of German scientists will play a key role, particularly in the NASA space program. In 1945, the power struggle with the Soviet giant has just begun. On August 2nd, a few kilometers away from Berlin, the Potsdam Conference is coming to an end. Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill sit next to the new American president. Harry Truman has replaced Franklin Roosevelt, who died during the war less than 4 months earlier.
The Potsdam Conference was the most important one after the end of World War II. This is when the Cold War actually began, even though it only broke out 2 years later. The Allies were holding the Soviets accountable for what was happening in Romania, Bulgaria, and all of Eastern Europe, since they were falling under the communist regime. Stalin, on the other hand, answered by asking questions about the situation in Greece, where the Anglo-Saxons were imposing a very unpopular government.
The future clash between the two blocs is also playing out in Germany. The Allies are dividing the territory among themselves. In the West, the British and the Americans each occupy a zone. France also claims a share as a victor. In the East, the USSR controls a large part of the country. The city of Berlin is divided into 4 sections as well. But for Stalin, Germany is merely the western link of a chain that crosses the entire eastern part of the continent.
During the spring of 1945, all of Central and Eastern Europe were under the diplomatic and military domination of the Red Army, which occupied all the countries in the area. Little by little, these countries fell under the political control of the communists.
Западные союзники
When the Western Allies freed these European countries, including Western Germany, the system they implemented wasn't anything new. Private property was preserved, and people's lifestyles remained the same. The only requirements were to comply to the demilitarization, to implement democratic governance, and to prevent and forbid Nazi protests and propaganda. On the Soviet side, however, as soon as their troops entered Europe, they had a completely different goal. They meant to establish regimes similar to the Soviet system, and so they laid down socialist politics, essentially seizing private property and thus establishing a totally different socio-economical order.
On August 6, 1945, at 8:16 a.m., the first atomic bomb in history explodes in the heart of the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It devastates everything in its path.
The immediate loss of life in the terrible heat, people burned to death, people incinerated, people asphyxiated, of course the radiation sickness that's going to follow. But a lot of the deaths were from the collapse of structures. It's just so devastating.
The Americans explain, or even justify, the use of the bomb by claiming it helped save lives. They plead that the human toll of victory, if they had used conventional weapons against Japan, would have amounted to several 100,000 soldiers.
It became more and more obvious as the Americans planned the invasion of the Hainan Islands that the losses would be so appalling, both on the Allied side, with 500,000 projected losses from their point of view, but also the millions of Japanese who would die in the fighting.
At least 70,000 people are killed that day, a number to which we must add the gravely wounded and the tens of thousands of victims who died in the following weeks. However, this bomb doesn't suffice to bring Japan to its knees.
The commanders of the Imperial Japanese Army and the Navy refused absolutely any idea of unconditional surrender. But even with the American offer of keeping the emperor, which was a key element in any question of what post-war Japan would be like, was not enough to satisfy the die-hard military commanders. And this was when the decision was finally taken to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki 3 days later. And at that point, the emperor had also received details of the devastation of Hiroshima. He knew that there was no option. I think that the shock of those nuclear explosions was what finally persuaded the emperor to order the surrender.
On September 2nd, 1945, the entire world is watching Tokyo Bay. On the bridge of the USS Missouri, the American battleship, a delegation representing the Japanese Empire comes to acknowledge defeat. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the Allies in the Southwest Pacific, addresses the world.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
World War II is now officially over. It has claimed the lives of over 50 million people, civilians for the most part. The end of the atrocities is a relief. But this relief comes with a new feeling. Since the month of August, something has permanently changed.
The idea of one bomb being able to destroy a whole major city was really unknown in human history up to this point in time. Everything changed. The nuclear age had begun, and we'd begun to see that human beings could create weapons so terrible that they could basically eliminate their own existence.
The echoes of the slaughters still resonate in the collective mind. The American soldiers come home, but in what condition? Many of them are traumatized, just like these men filmed by famous cinematographer John Huston at a Long Island hospital. These images would remain censored by the Pentagon until 1980.
And then after you got wounded, what happened?
Like my nerves keep getting worse on.
They get worse.
These airplanes, they bombed. I got killed nearly every morning.
The patients in uniform open up, crack, and reveal the extent of the psychological damage caused by the horrors of the war.
A display of emotion is all right.
I'm not doing this deliberately, so please believe me.
I do believe you. Well, I guess I just got tired of living, put it that way. I had trouble sleeping, yes, had dreaming of combat, you know.
My buddy's gone, and I figured the next one was for me. A man can just stand so much up there, so.
These images show the treatments used in an attempt to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, such as hypnosis.
The thoughts are coming to your mind now. Well, now let's go back. Let's go back to Friday. We want to get you out of your own feeling of isolation. To get you to feel that you are like other people.
Or even group therapy.
Say the net result is like this.
For these young men, the issue is their inability to get back to a normal life. Their road will be fraught with difficulties. Because in the background, the many years of war have completely reshuffled the cards. During the conflicts, women started holding new positions.
Most men were either locked up or fighting on various fronts. This meant that for the first time, women were taking jobs that normally had been reserved for men in industry and other parts of the economy.
In America, as well as in Europe, the shockwave following World War II hits every household.
Women stopped just being housewives and became responsible for keeping things going. And that, of course, enhanced the status of women, which they were not really all that keen to give up after the war.
However, gender equality is still a very distant prospect.
In 1945 and in the subsequent period, there was a terrible anticlimax for women because the men would return, they would be given back their jobs, but above all, the men had felt that they'd lost control of their families in a way, that they were no longer sort of the center, and there was therefore a tremendous amount of repression.
But in 1945, societal issues are far from being the priority of the Allied leaders. Those who defeated Nazism are now concerned about the political future of the world. On October 24th, 1945, the UN Charter officially goes into effect. Signed 4 months earlier during the San Francisco Conference, The document establishes the creation of a brand new institution, the United Nations. 51 countries, representing about 80% of the world's population, demonstrate a great deal of ambition about the future of the world.
The idea is we can never have a war like this again, and that maybe the United Nations, we can begin to quell conflict around the planet. And maybe we can do that if the superpowers will work together sufficiently to do so.
Men of goodwill from around the world attend.
The Americans were reluctantly brought into world wars twice, in 1917 and 1941. They learned their lesson, namely that it was impossible for them not to get involved in global affairs. And so, they decided to lead an international system, even in peaceful times, hoping to avoid conflicts of this magnitude going forward. Through this dream of a new world order, the Americans basically wanted to promote their own values. Therefore, this new world order would be ruled by law and security.
If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.
Russia's Vyacheslav Molotov addresses the delegates. Mr. Molotov warns of the mistakes of the League of Nations.
For the USSR, it was extremely important not only to participate in this organization, but also to create a Security Council with the right to vote and the power of veto that would only be reserved for the Allies. To the Soviet Union, the UN and the Security Council represented a unique opportunity for the great powers, of which the USSR was now a part. It was their chance to divide the world through negotiations in the spirit of, this is yours, this is ours. It was very clear to Stalin that it was in his best interest to divide the world into spheres of influence.
The threat of the Cold War is already looming, but the victors of 1945 are still joining forces. On November 20th, a historical trial begins in the courthouse of Nuremberg. In the city where anti-Semitic laws had been declared and where Nazis had organized huge rallies, the prosecutors from the Allied countries read the criminal charges. A reading that takes 5 hours.
The trial was set in the hopes of establishing an international system ruled by law and justice.
In the name of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, General Rudenko presents counsel.
The idea of having trials, it was interestingly enough encouraged more by the Soviets than it was by the Americans. The Soviets partly because the Soviets were used to show trials, and they liked to use trials for political ends.
In the name of the French Republic, Monsieur de Menton...
That was not, of course, what the British and the Americans and the French wanted. What they wanted was to, as part of this exercise of restoring the world order, was to make a point of the rule of law. And the rule of law meant that you had to give the leaders of your former enemies a fair trial, not just put them up against the wall and shoot them.
SS, police, and Wehrmacht were always discharged their duties in an exemplary manner. The Reichsführer SS ordered the cleaning out of the ghettos.
The Nuremberg trials were created to define crimes against humanity. It was established that certain crimes were so important and so serious that all of mankind was affected, as opposed to only a population or a fraction of a population.
This trial must form a milestone in the history of civilization, not only marking that right shall in the end triumph over evil, but also that ordinary people of the world are now determined that the individual must transcend the state.
The Nuremberg trials, during which 22 people were prosecuted, 12 of whom were sentenced to death, some to long prison sentences, while others were acquitted, were considered favorably by the experts, who saw this as an important victory for justice. To most Germans, it was an understandable reaction from the Americans and their allies.
Our task is finished. Now it is for you, in the silence of your deliberations, to listen to innocent blood crying for justice.
It also, for the first time, made the defense that I was simply following orders inadmissible. If the orders are immoral, you do not obey them. It cannot be an argument anymore. And the Nuremberg trials really laid down that principle. So it was, again, a way to build a better world that would make future wars harder.
The sentences from the Nuremberg trials will not be rendered until October of 1946. Meanwhile, in December 1945, the United States and Europe celebrate Christmas and dream of a better future.
The year 1945 was enormously consequential. It led to the destruction of two of the most monstrous empires in human history, Nazi Germany and militaristic Imperial Japan.
On the victor's side, a new world emerges, opposing the United States to the Soviet Union. The European nations are unable to hide their decline. In India, the British Empire is about to collapse. The colonies demand their freedom. In Indochina, as well as Africa, France will soon return to war. The clash of decolonization is looming.
1945 is a quintessentially modern year in that sense that it lays the foundation for what is our world today.
At the end of 1945, a new world is just emerging. A world filled with promises and riddled with new threats.